They left him on the side of the road. No food, no name, just a blindfold over his eyes and a torn suitcase at his side. A storm was coming. And still, he didn't move. He wasn't waiting for help. He was waiting for someone who was never coming back. Miles away. A boy who hadn't spoken in 6 months began to draw the image of a dog he'd never met, lying beside a suitcase. This isn't a story about a rescue. It's a story about 2 broken hearts who stayed. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the sky over Ashford, Washington still hung heavy and swollen with clouds, as if unsure whether to weep again or hold back. The roads were slick with runoff, mist curled at the edges of pine-lined lanes, and the late afternoon air held the raw chill that only follows a mountain storm, just beyond the town's limits. Where the road thinned near the edge of Mount Rainier National Park, a battered blacktop curved into silence. It was there, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, that something stirred, a presence far too still to be missed. Sheriff Emily Foster leaned against the steering wheel of her cruiser, rubbing the back of her neck. The scent of wet pine seeped through the cracked window, earthy and sharp. She was in her early 40s, with a narrow build and a posture that betrayed years of holding herself together. Her chestnut brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, streaked with gray at the temples, a premature touch earned not by age but by grief. Ever since her husband Mark died 3 years ago in a logging accident just north of town, Emily had turned quieter, her smiles rarer, her silences deeper, but she never stopped doing her job. That afternoon, she'd been driving back from a remote cabin check-in, her patrol nearly over, when her headlights caught something odd up ahead. It looked like an old suitcase, half sunken in a puddle on the roadside gravel. Not uncommon, Ashford saw its share of strange roadside dumps, but something about the shape next to it made her pulse quicken. She braked hard, tires crunching on wet stone, and stepped into the fading daylight. Her boots splashed in the shallow water as she approached. The suitcase was old, brown, and scuffed, but beside it, curled into a still heap, was a small dog, no more than 4 months old, trembling but silent. Its fur was dark sable, soaked and matted against its narrow ribs. A strip of white cloth had been tied tightly around its head, covering its eyes completely. "Oh no," Emily breathed, crouching slowly. The dog didn't flinch. Its ears twitched once, barely. Its paws were raw, scraped from gravel and exposure. The cloth wrapped around its head had cut into the tender fur behind its ears, leaving red lines. And though its body shook faintly with each breath, it never moved from its spot against the suitcase. A folded piece of paper was duct taped to the top of the case. The ink had bled in the rain, but the message was still readable. Too noisy? Free dog. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She reached out gently and brushed the fabric from the puppy's eyes. Slowly, it blinked against the soft gray light. Confused, deep brown eyes met hers for a split second before they turned downward again, and the pup laid its head back on the damp leather. "Hey there, buddy," she whispered. "You're not trash." She glanced around, but the forest was still. Whoever had done this was long gone. Emily carefully wrapped the pup in the emergency blanket from her car, suitcase and all, and drove back toward the station in town. Ashford wasn't big, less than 400 people, with only one general store, one diner, and one sheriff's office where Emily worked mostly alone. She placed the puppy in a warm corner near the heater and laid the suitcase beside him. He didn't bark, didn't whimper, didn't eat, just pressed his little body tighter to the side of the suitcase as if guarding it, or waiting for someone who wouldn't return. Hours passed. The rain began again outside, tapping gently against the windows. Emily sat at her desk, unable to concentrate. Her thoughts kept returning to the boyish face of the dog, the way his eyes had looked straight through her, and the silence that clung to him like fog. She stood and crossed the room, crouching down once more beside the puppy. "I don't know who left you there," she murmured, "but you don't have to wait anymore." Still. The pup didn't move. His breath was shallow, his fur damp despite the towel she'd wrapped him in earlier. His front leg trembled slightly, maybe from the cold or exhaustion. Emily reached out and rested a hand gently on his back. "You're safe now," she said, and even though he didn't lift his head, his paw inched closer to the suitcase. Emily closed her eyes, exhaling a long, tired breath. She would call Walt in the morning, the old trainer she trusted with the fragile ones, but for tonight, she would stay. She brewed a cup of tea, pulled a spare blanket from the supply closet, and settled on the floor near the heater. The dog didn't make a sound, but his presence filled the room like a story begging not to be forgotten. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, Sheriff Emily Foster sat with a dog that didn't yet have a name, beside a suitcase no one had claimed, in a small town where even silence could echo. The morning in Ashford came cold and colorless, the sun hidden behind heavy skies that pressed down on the small mountain town, like a weight no one could quite shrug off. Sheriff Emily Foster stood at the edge of the station's small kennel room, sipping black coffee that had long gone lukewarm. In the corner, the puppy, Bruno, though no one had said his name aloud yet, still lay curled beside the battered suitcase, as unmoving as he had been the night before. His dark fur had dried in stiff waves, and his raw paws were tucked beneath him, like he had forgotten they could move. Emily watched him in silence for a while before picking up her phone. She dialed the number from memory. "Walt," she said when the line picked up. "I need a favor." Walt Thompson had run the Pine Creek Animal Rescue for 15 years, but long before that, he'd trained working dogs for search and rescue. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, Walt had a deep, weathered face, a silver beard that met the collar of his flannel shirt, and a voice like gravel warmed by kindness. He lived just outside Ashford, in a repurposed barn behind his modest home, where he kept a few dogs, a wood stove, and the quiet kind of wisdom born of listening more than speaking. By late morning, Emily had driven Bruno out to Pine Creek in the back of her cruiser. The dog didn't resist. He didn't react. He simply lay against the suitcase, blinking slowly as the road twisted into forest. When she arrived, Walt was waiting outside, his arms crossed over his chest, 2 border collies sitting alertly at his feet. "I've never seen one that still before," he said quietly, watching as Emily opened the back. Bruno didn't move, even as the car door opened. Walt crouched, moving with the practiced calm of someone who'd spent a lifetime convincing scared creatures to trust again. "He's about 4 months, Emily said. "German Shepherd. Found him like this, blindfolded, tied beside that suitcase. Note said he was too noisy." Walt's eyes narrowed, and now he's silent. He gently picked up the dog, suitcase and all, and carried him inside. The rescue was a warm space built into what used to be a horse barn. The walls were lined with kennels, most empty, and soft music played from a speaker high on a shelf. Walt set Bruno down in a quiet corner beside a thick mat and left the suitcase where the dog could touch it. A bowl of water and soft food were placed nearby. Untouched that afternoon, another regular visitor arrived, a boy named Jonah Miller. Jonah was 8 years old and had been coming to Pine Creek every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the past month. His father, Peter, a local mechanic, would drop him off while running errands. Jonah never spoke, not to the staff, not to the dogs, not to his father. He hadn't spoken since the night his mother died in a car crash the previous spring. Since then, he'd retreated into a world of drawings, carrying a small leather-bound sketchbook everywhere like armor. Jonah was small for his age, with sandy brown hair cut unevenly and always falling into his eyes. He wore the same green hoodie every visit and kept the hood up, even indoors. When he entered the barn, Walt greeted him with a nod, and Jonah replied with a slight shift of his head, his version of a wave. He took his usual spot near the back corner, beside a crate filled with art supplies, and opened his sketchbook. But that day, something was different. Instead of sitting with his back to the animals, as he usually did, Jonah turned and stared at the new arrival, at the puppy, at the suitcase. His eyes lingered there, wide, unreadable. Emily, still sipping her coffee, noticed the shift too. He's never paid attention like that before. Walt, arms crossed, nodded slowly. Jonah didn't move for several minutes. Then, with a quiet deliberateness rare for a boy his age, he pulled a pencil from his bag and began to sketch. Emily approached softly, not wanting to startle him. Anne peered over his shoulder. There, in simple but careful lines, was a dog curled against a suitcase. The proportions were strikingly accurate. The angle of the legs, the shape of the suitcase's tiers, even the small cut above the dog's right ear. Jonah had never seen Bruno before. He hadn't been told anything, but somehow, he drew him exactly. Emily crouched beside him. "You saw him?" she asked gently. Jonah didn't answer. He simply turned the page and began another sketch. This time, the same dog, standing in the rain, eyes covered by a strip of cloth. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Peter Miller arrived 30 minutes later to pick up his son. A man of few words, Peter was tall and wiry, with oil-stained jeans and tired blue eyes. Since his wife's passing, he'd withdrawn, speaking only when necessary, and clung to routine like a lifeline. He watched Jonah carefully, always uncertain whether to step closer or give him space. "He okay today?" he asked Walt gruffly. Walt gave a small nod, quiet but focused. Peter gave the smallest smile and led Jonah out, his hand hovering near the boy's back but never touching. That evening, after the shelter closed, Walt found Bruno in the same position, head against the suitcase, eyes barely open. He sat beside him, the barn lit only by the orange glow of the stove. "I think you met someone today?" Walt said softly. "Someone like you." Bruno didn't move, but his ears twitched, just slightly. Walt laid a folded blanket near him and left the barn lights low. As he stepped outside into the falling dusk, he saw Emily still sitting in her cruiser, staring out across the trees. "I don't understand how the boy knew," she said when he approached. Walt rubbed his beard. "Some hearts recognize each other even before they know how to speak." Emily looked back at the barn. "You think they'll help each other? I think they already have." Morning in Ashford broke with a pale, reluctant sun peeking through frost-laced pines. The air was still, the kind of quiet that seemed to pause even the wind. At Pine Creek Rescue, the barn was hushed except for the low hum of the old space heater near the corner stall, where Bruno still lay beside his suitcase. But something had begun to shift in him. Not a dramatic change, not a leap or bark, but a subtle, nearly imperceptible softening. Walt had noticed it first, the day before, when he brought in fresh blankets. He'd caught Bruno blinking with more awareness, his ears pricking faintly when footsteps crossed the floor. He hadn't moved toward anyone. Not yet, but he wasn't recoiling anymore. That morning, Jonah arrived quietly as always, bundled in a gray hoodie and jeans too short at the ankles. His sketchbook was clutched tightly in his arms. He didn't say a word to Peter, who gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder before driving off in his rusted pickup truck. The boy made his way straight to the corner, where he always sat, and looked, just looked, at Bruno for a long while before opening to a fresh page. Walt, sweeping near the kennels, pretended not to watch, but he always did. After 15 minutes, Jonah set down his pencil and carefully tore the page from his book. This one showed Bruno again, but not lying beside the suitcase. This time, the drawing captured the pup with his head slightly lifted, eyes open, gazing toward the viewer. It was a simple but powerful image, hope peeking through weariness. Jonah walked slowly toward Bruno, the drawing in hand. He stopped a foot away and knelt, gently sliding the page forward so that it rested near Bruno's paws. Then, he returned to his seat. Bruno didn't move at first, but after a few long minutes, he lifted his head. His eyes tracked the paper, his nose twitched, then he shifted forward, just an inch, and laid his paw across the edge of the drawing. Walt saw it from across the barn. His broom stopped mid-sweep. He exhaled softly. A breath like prayer. This small ritual repeated for days. Every morning, Jonah would draw something new, Bruno in different forms, or abstract swirls of light and shadows, and place the page gently beside the dog. And each day, Bruno inched a little closer, a tail twitch, a paw stretched out, a longer blink. It was slow, but unmistakable. Emily stopped by that Friday afternoon, her badge clipped loosely to her coat, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a brown bag of pastries from the diner in the other. She leaned against the doorframe, watching the quiet scene between boy and dog unfold. "He's moving," she said softly to Walt, who joined her with crossed arms. "He's choosing," Walt replied. "A little more every day." That night, Emily visited her husband's grave. The cemetery lay on a small hill just beyond town, the view stretching down to the valley below. She didn't speak aloud, didn't cry. She just stood there with her hand on the cold stone and let the silence sit with her. Then she whispered, "They're saving each other. Mark, you'd like them." Back at the rescue, something happened the next morning. Jonah arrived earlier than usual, his cheeks pink from the cold. He sat cross-legged on the barn floor, holding a new drawing, a picture of himself beside Bruno. Both were standing. There were no words on the page, only their shadows cast long in the sunlight behind them. He placed it by Bruno, then settled back. The minutes passed. Then Bruno stood. It wasn't graceful. His hind leg shook, and his front paw hesitated. But he pushed up slowly and took 3 cautious steps forward. When he reached the drawing, he sat, and then, incredibly, nudged it gently with his nose toward Jonah. The boy's eyes widened. He looked at Walt, who had frozen mid-step, then back at Bruno, and softly, so softly Walt barely heard it, Jonah whispered, "Bruno." The name slipped from his lips like a fragile thread of light, his first word in over half a year. Walt dropped the blanket he'd been holding. Emily, who had just walked in with a clipboard, stopped in her tracks. Jonah looked at the dog, who was now watching him, ears forward. Emily crouched slowly. "Did you say that?" Sweetheart Jonah didn't answer. Instead, he looked back at Bruno, then repeated, just a little louder, "Bruno!" The dog's tail swept once across the floor. Walt's voice cracked. "Well, I guess that settles it." Emily's eyes glistened as she nodded, smiling in disbelief. He's got a name. From that day forward, something opened in both of them. The story spread, first among the rescue volunteers, then to the diner staff, the librarian, the Sunday market folks. The tale of a broken boy and a silent dog who'd found each other. Jonah's teacher sent a handwritten note to Walt. One simple sentence. "Please let me know if he speaks again." And he did. Not often. Not loud, but more and more. To Bruno. He would sit beside the dog in the straw-lined stall, whispering things no one else could hear. Bruno would listen, ears tilted, eyes calm. It wasn't training, it wasn't therapy. It was something older than those things. It was trust. One evening, a woman named Hattie Blake visited the shelter. She was a retired nurse in her early 70s with bright silver hair and a blue scarf always tied at her throat. Hattie had long volunteered in town events and had once been Jonah's neighbor before his family moved after the accident. "I heard about the boy," she said to Walt, offering a tin of ginger cookies, "and I thought, maybe I could help somehow." She peeked into the barn and watched Jonah and Bruno for several minutes. Then she sat quietly beside Emily near the stove and simply said, "Sometimes, the ones who've lost the most are the ones who teach the rest of us how to hold on." No one replied. There was nothing to add. That night, as snow began to fall outside and the world turned white once again, Bruno stood and walked the few steps to where Jonah sat, curled against the wall, sketching. The dog nudged Jonah's shoulder gently, then laid down beside him, resting his head on the boy's knee. Jonah smiled and whispered again, "Bruno." The light was soft, the barn was quiet, and for the first time in a long, long while, both of them looked like they had finally found a beginning. The wind returned to Ashford like a memory, uninvited, relentless, and louder than it had any right to be. Clouds rolled over the mountain ridges in thick waves, soaking the sky in bruised shades of gray. By early afternoon, the trees had begun to bend beneath the gusts, and the chill in the air bit down like a warning. It was the kind of storm that made people cancel plans and double-lock doors. But inside the barn, at Pine Creek Rescue, it was still warm, still quiet. Jonah sat near the hay-lined stall where Bruno usually rested. He had drawn something new that morning, a picture of a house with a glowing window and a dog curled up beside it. The colors were brighter than usual, his lines less tight, more hopeful. Bruno had taken to lying beside him, resting his chin on Jonah's leg, occasionally nosing the boy's sleeve like a quiet thank you. But that day, something felt different. Walt was outside hammering boards over the smaller windows, muttering about the wind. His face, usually calm, was tight with concern. Emily had just called to say the roads near the northern ridge were washing out and that people should avoid travel. The scent of pine and wet earth carried through the half-open barn door. Jonah looked up when the door creaked harder than usual. He scanned the stall beside him. Bruno was gone, at first. Jonah thought the dog might have followed Walt, but then he noticed the suitcase, still sitting near the corner, untouched, and that was the first sign something was wrong. Bruno never left without it. Jonah stood slowly, gripping his sketchbook to his chest. His eyes darted across the barn, then to the open side door swaying on its hinges. Cold air slapped his face. He tried to call out, but nothing came. His voice, still young in its return, failed him. He ran outside. "Walt!" he shouted, barely above the wind. The old man turned from the barn side, his coat flapping in the gusts. "Jonah? He's gone," Jonah cried, and pointed toward the trees. Walt's face shifted instantly, the hammer dropping into the mud. Inside, 10 minutes. The entire town of Ashford was looking. Sheriff Emily was the first to respond. She drove her cruiser straight to the rescue and parked sideways in front of the barn, her boots splashing through standing water. "What happened?" she asked Walt, her voice clipped but worried. "Storm came in strong," Walt replied. "I thought he was still inside, but—" He paused, shaking his head. "He's not." Emily glanced at Jonah, whose face was pale and wet, more from fear than rain. He clutched his sketchbook tightly, his eyes wide and darting, as if scanning the forest for the dog's shadow. Emily crouched. "Did you see where he went?" Jonah opened the sketchbook and flipped to a blank page. Then he began to draw. His fingers shook from cold, but the pencil moved quickly, lines forming a road, trees, and something at the edge. When he was done, he turned the page toward Emily, a suitcase, old, worn, lying beneath a crooked tree. Beside it, a curled-up dog. Emily stood, heart sinking. "He went back," she said. "He's trying to find the beginning." Ashford's small-town spirit took over. People donned raincoats, carried flashlights, and checked sheds, ditches, and trails. The storm howled louder, thunder cracking in the distance. Emily drove slowly through the back roads, high beams cutting through the downpour. She didn't know where exactly he might have gone, but she trusted something unspoken. Bruno had followed the past. Hours passed. The roads grew more dangerous, the sky darker. But then, just at the edge of a clearing near the forest line, close to where Emily had first found him weeks ago, her headlights caught something, an old suitcase, and beside it, a small dark form curled against the mud. Emily slammed the brakes and jumped out, rain pelting her shoulders. She sank to her knees in the wet grass beside him. "Bruno," she whispered. He was soaked through, his fur caked in mud, his sides heaving slowly. But his eyes were open. They met hers, not with panic, but with something else. Sadness, uncertainty. Like he was asking her a question he didn't quite know how to phrase. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. "No." She murmured into his fur. "Not again. You don't have to wait alone anymore." Bruno trembled, but didn't resist. He let himself be held. The suitcase sat beside them, empty, useless, but still somehow tethered to him. Emily looked up at the sky and closed her eyes, letting the rain wash over them both. For the first time in years. She didn't feel the cold. She only felt the weight of something deeper. A second chance. Back at the barn, Jonah waited inside, eyes never leaving the open doorway. When the cruiser returned, Jonah ran out before the headlights even cut. He saw Emily open the back and lift Bruno into her arms. The dog looked up, eyes dull but safe. Jonah dropped his sketchbook, sprinted to them, and wrapped his arms around the dog's soaked frame. Bruno licked his cheek weakly, and Jonah whispered, "You came back." Emily knelt beside them. "No," she said, smiling through her tears. "He never left you. He just had to make sure the pain was really over." Bruno lay on the rug inside the barn that night. Jonah pressed close beside him. Emily left a blanket draped over them both. The suitcase sat nearby, closed, untouched. The storm outside kept raging, but inside, everything was still. Spring arrived gently in Ashford, as if afraid to startle the town awake. The snow had thinned to a memory, and the earth, damp and dark, began breathing again. Daffodils pushed shyly through thawed soil near fence posts, and the air carried the faint scent of cedar and promise. The storm had passed weeks ago, but something deeper had changed in its wake, not in the weather, but in the hearts that had weathered it. Inside the Miller home, a modest, 2-bedroom cabin with a rust-red roof and a porch that creaked in the wind. Bruno now slept curled beneath Jonah's bed. His dark sable fur had thickened and grown sleek with care, and his once silent eyes now held a steady warmth. Every night, just after Jonah brushed his teeth and changed into pajamas, Bruno would wait by the bedside, ears twitching until Jonah patted the rug. Only then would he rest, his head draped over the boy's slippers like a sentinel standing watch. Jonah had changed too. He spoke now, softly but often, not only to Bruno, but to his father, to Emily, even to Hattie Blake at the Saturday market. His words came in gentle waves, tentative and unpolished, but each one was a triumph. He'd returned to school 2 weeks ago, sitting near the back of the room with a sharpened pencil and his sketchbook tucked beside his folder. His teacher, Ms. Kelly Dunn, a cheerful woman in her late 30s with curly auburn hair and a knack for hand-painted earrings, had greeted him with tears in her eyes when he answered roll call with a whispered, "Here." Peter Miller watched these changes with quiet awe, a lean man in his 40s, with sun-worn skin and grease-stained hands. Peter had always been more comfortable under a car hood than in conversation, but watching his son bloom again, healing inch by inch beside a dog once discarded, had softened something in him. At night, he would pause at Jonah's bedroom door, hand resting on the frame, just to listen to his son reading softly to Bruno from picture books they'd nearly given away. The adoption had been finalized on a bright Wednesday morning. Emily had driven them to the courthouse in her cruiser, Walt riding in the passenger seat beside her. Bruno sat in the back between Jonah and Peter, tail thumping lightly against the seat with each turn of the road. At the county office, an older clerk named Lyle, that's tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice like creaking wood, guided them through the paperwork with a slow, warm patience. "You folks sure about this?" he asked, peering over the rim of his glasses with a faint smile. Peter looked at Jonah, who looked at Bruno. "Yes, sir," Peter said. "We're sure." After the signature was stamped, Jonah held Bruno's collar gently and whispered something no one else could hear. Then he smiled, not just with his mouth but with his entire small face, and clutched the folder that held their future. At home that evening, Jonah spent hours creating something special on a quiet stretch of the living room floor, with markers and cut-out hearts. He transformed an old shoebox into a tribute. He glued pieces of red and blue paper around it, then carefully printed 4 words in blocky, slanted letters. "Not trash, my hero." Then, with his father's help, they transferred the decorations to the old suitcase, the same one Bruno had once guarded like it held his whole world. Now it sat beside the window, lined with a new fleece blanket. Bruno still touched it with his nose each morning, but not in fear, just as if checking an old memory that no longer hurt. Sheriff Emily visited often. She never stayed long, just enough to bring dog treats, check on Jonah's progress, and drink half a cup of Peter's overbrewed coffee. But each time she came, she'd kneel beside Bruno and scratch gently behind his ears. "You're still watching out for him." "Huh," she'd whisper, and Bruno's tail would swish across the wooden floor in reply. At the Pine Creek Rescue, Walt and Hattie continued their work. They added a small bulletin board titled "The Ones Who Stayed," featuring photos of animals who had found permanent homes. In the center was a drawing by Jonah, himself and Bruno walking beneath a wide blue sky, the sun stretching long shadows behind them. Walt had framed it in a salvaged cedar frame, his eyes misting slightly when he hung it. "I think," he'd said to Hattie, "we saved each other more than we ever saved that dog." Hattie, now helping with weekly reading hours for kids and shelter dogs, nodded. That's how it usually works. One Saturday, as the town held its spring fair, Jonah and Bruno were invited to join a small parade down Main Street. The boy wore a green jacket with a felt sheriff star pinned to it, and Bruno trotted beside him with a red scarf tied neatly around his neck. Emily walked behind them, beaming. Peter stood near the booth selling caramel corn, arms crossed but smiling more than he had in years. As they passed the old grocery store, someone called out, "That's the dog, isn't it? The one from the barn?" Jonah turned, stood a little taller, and said clearly, "His name is Bruno." The crowd clapped, some cheered, later that night. Under soft lamplight and a quilt passed down from Jonah's grandmother, the boy sat on his bed and stroked Bruno's ears. "You stayed," he whispered, and Bruno, already drifting to sleep, gave a quiet breath, like the last chapter of a story he was proud to have finished. Sometimes, miracles don't come in thunder or lightning. They arrive quietly, on 4 legs, with tired eyes, a broken past, and a heart still willing to trust. Bruno was more than just a dog left beside a suitcase. He was a whisper from God, a reminder that even what the world throws away can still carry the power to heal. God often chooses the smallest and the silenced to reveal his greatest truths, through a boy who had forgotten how to speak, and a dog who had forgotten how to wag his tail. He showed us that love is louder than pain, that staying can be more powerful than saving, and that even in our loneliest moments, someone is watching over us. Maybe you're like Jonah. Maybe you've been silent for too long. Or maybe you're like Bruno, still waiting for someone to come back for you, wherever you are. Let this story remind you, you are not forgotten. Miracles are still happening, through love, through second chances, and through the quiet faith that someone, somewhere, still believes in you. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment below and tell us what part moved you the most. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next true story of faith and hope. And if you believe that God still works in small, quiet miracles, type Amen in the comments. May He bless your journey as He did theirs.